The burgundy dress hung in my closet like a ghost of better times. I'd worn it to Annie's high school graduation, her college commencement, and later, to celebrate her first promotion at the marketing firm. Each time, she'd told me how elegant I looked, how proud she was to have me as her mother. Now, as I smoothed the fabric over my 62-year-old frame, I wondered if this would be the last time I dressed up for my daughter. 3 weeks had passed since our explosive argument about her wedding budget. $65,000. That's what Annie and her fiancé, Henry, had demanded I contribute. Not asked, demanded. As if my late husband's life insurance money, the nest egg I'd carefully preserved for my retirement, was somehow their birthright. "Mom, you're being selfish," she'd said, her voice sharp as winter wind. "You're sitting on all that money while we're trying to start our life together. Don't you want me to be happy?" I'd tried to explain that happiness didn't require imported Italian marble or a honeymoon in the Maldives. I'd offered $15,000, enough for a beautiful local ceremony. But Annie had looked at me with such contempt, such calculation, that I barely recognized the little girl who used to bring me dandelions and call them sunshine flowers. Then, the phone call came. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. Maybe we've both been too stubborn. Could we talk over dinner? I want to work this out." My heart lifted despite itself. Maybe the silence had given her time to reflect. Maybe becoming a mother herself, she was 3 months along, had awakened something in her that understood sacrifice. "I'd like that, sweetheart," I said, already planning what I'd cook, what I'd say to rebuild the bridge between us. "Actually, Henry and I thought we'd take you out. That Italian place on Meridian Street, Franco's. Franco's. Where Harold had taken me for our 25th anniversary. Where the tables were intimate, the lighting soft enough to hide the tears I suspected we'd both shed as we found our way back to each other." Now, as I applied my lipstick with the steady hand of a woman who'd learned to present strength even when she felt brittle, I allowed myself a moment of hope. Maybe Annie's pregnancy had given her perspective. Maybe she'd realized family meant more than extravagant weddings and social media-worthy celebrations. The drive to Franco's took me through the neighborhood where I'd raised Annie and her brother, Michael. Past the elementary school where I'd volunteered in the library. Past the park where I'd pushed her on swings until my arms ached. Past the community center where I'd taught her to waltz before her first formal dance. Each landmark felt like a page in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to close. Franco's looked exactly as I remembered, warm brick facade, window boxes overflowing with late autumn mums, the soft glow of candlelight visible through gauze curtains. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes, led me to a corner table where Annie was already seated. My daughter looked radiant in the way only pregnant women can, her skin glowing, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. She wore a designer dress I didn't recognize, something that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. "Mom." She rose to embrace me. And for a moment, breathing in her familiar perfume, I felt the familiar surge of maternal love that had defined my life for 34 years. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," I said. And I meant it. Whatever our differences, whatever pain lay between us, she was still my daughter. "How are you feeling? Any morning sickness?" "Better now. The second trimester is supposed to be easier." She touched her belly, a gesture both protective and possessive. "Henry should be here any minute. He got held up at the office." Henry Smith. 36 years old. Ambitious. Charming when he wanted to be. He worked in commercial real estate, with the kind of confidence that came from a life without significant setbacks. I tried to like him, tried to see what Annie saw beyond his expensive suits and casual dismissal of anyone he deemed less successful than himself. "I'm glad you called," I said, settling into my chair. "I've missed you." Something flickered across her face. Guilt? Regret? But before I could examine it further, Henry appeared at our table, not alone, but followed by 3 men in dark suits carrying briefcases. "Mrs. McKenna," Henry said, his smile too bright, too practiced. "Thank you for joining us." The men took seats around our small table, transforming our intimate dinner into what felt like a business meeting. My stomach tightened as I recognized the choreographed nature of their arrival. This wasn't a coincidence. This was planned. "Annie," I said carefully. "Who are these gentlemen?" "Mom, these are some colleagues of Henry's. They have some paperwork they'd like you to look at." One of the men, silver-haired, with the kind of predatory smile I'd learned to recognize in my years as a secretary at a law firm, leaned forward. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm Richard Kirk, Henry's attorney. We've prepared some documents that we believe will be beneficial for everyone involved." The words hung in the air like smoke. "What kind of documents?" I asked, though I already knew. Henry cleared his throat. "It's quite simple, Mrs. McKenna. We're asking you to sign a power of attorney to allow us to manage your financial affairs. Given your age and the fact that you're living alone now, it just makes sense to have someone younger handling your investments, your property decisions." "My age," I repeated quietly. "I'm 62, Henry. Not 92. "Of course," he said, patronizing. "But these things are complex. Real estate markets, investment portfolios, it's not something you should have to worry about." I looked at Annie, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to show some sign this ambush wasn't her idea. But she sat silent, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the table. The attorney slid a manila folder toward me. "If you could just sign here, and initial there, we can get everything squared away tonight." I opened the folder, though I already knew what I'd find. Power of attorney documents. Control over my bank accounts, my house, my insurance policies, everything Harold and I had worked 40 years to build. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. Annie finally looked up. The expression in her eyes was one I'd never seen before. Cold. Calculating. Final. "Then you won't see your grandchild grow up," she said simply. "It's your choice, Mom. But you should know, Henry and I have been talking to a lawyer about grandparents' rights. They're quite limited, especially when the grandparent has shown a pattern of being difficult." The restaurant faded around me, the soft jazz, the clink of glasses, the murmur of other diners, all dissolving into white noise. I stared at my daughter. The woman I'd carried for 9 months. Nursed through childhood illnesses. Celebrated through every milestone. When had she become this stranger? "I see," I said quietly. I reached into my purse, past my wallet, past my reading glasses, past the small photo of Annie and Michael I'd carried for years. My fingers found my phone. "Mom, what are you doing?" Annie's voice held a note of uncertainty now. I pressed call. "Hello, Michael? It's Mom. I need you to come to Franco's. Now." I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the table beside the manila folder. "I think," I said, looking directly at Annie, "that before I sign anything, someone else should have a say." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Henry shifted in his seat, his confident facade cracking. The lawyers exchanged glances, the look seasoned predators give when their prey doesn't behave as expected. "Mom," Annie said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she'd perfected as a teenager, "there's no need to involve Michael. This is between us." "Is it?" I folded my hands in my lap, surprised by how steady they felt. "Because when you bring 3 lawyers to what you called a reconciliation dinner, you've already involved quite a few people." Richard Kirk cleared his throat. "Mrs. McKenna, perhaps we should discuss this more privately. Family matters can be emotional." "Can they?" I met his gaze directly. How thoughtful of you to notice. 23 minutes. That's how long it would take Michael to drive here if he hit the lights right. 23 minutes to navigate this minefield without stepping on the explosives my daughter had laid. Henry leaned forward, his salesman's smile firmly in place. Look, Mrs. McKenna, Annie, may I call you Annie? We're going to be family soon. You may call me Mrs. McKenna. His smile faltered. Of course. Mrs. McKenna. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not trying to take anything from you. We just want to help you manage your assets more efficiently. Maximize your returns. Make sure you're positioned well for retirement. I see. And how much would this help cost me? The lawyers stirred like vultures. Henry's jaw tightened. There would be some administrative costs, naturally. But really, this is about family. About making sure Annie and the baby are secure. The baby. I turned to my daughter, now studying her manicured nails with sudden intensity. Tell me, Annie, when exactly did you start planning this evening? Mom, I don't know what you mean. When did you call Henry's lawyer friends? Before or after you called me about reconciliation? She lifted her chin, Harold's stubborn streak, twisted into something I didn't recognize. Does it matter? It matters to me. Fine. The word came out sharp, brittle. We've been discussing options for weeks. Ever since you made it clear you don't care about my happiness, or my future. Options. I tasted the word. Bitter. Is that what we're calling extortion now? It's not extortion. Annie's voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. It's family. It's what families do for each other. What families do, I said quietly, is support each other without lawyers and ultimatums. One of the younger attorneys leaned forward. Mrs. McKenna, if I may, grandparents' rights in this state are quite limited. If your daughter chooses to restrict access to her child, your legal recourse would be. Excuse me. The voice came from behind me, familiar, warm. Michael stood beside our table, still in his hospital scrubs, his dark hair mussed from what had obviously been a rushed drive. At 37, my son had inherited his father's steady presence and his grandmother's sharp eyes that missed nothing. I'm Dr. Johnson, he said to the table, though his gaze lingered on Henry. I believe you called me, Mom. I did. I gestured to the empty chair the hostess had provided. Michael, meet your sisters, colleagues. His eyes swept the table, the lawyers, the manila folder, the tension thick enough to cut. As an ER physician, he knew how to assess a situation quickly. Colleagues, he repeated. I see. Henry stood, extending his hand. Henry Smith. Your sister's fiancé. These are some business associates of mine. We were just discussing financial planning with your mother. Michael shook his hand briefly, then sat without acknowledging the lawyers. Financial planning? At Franco's. On a Tuesday night. With Annie 3 months pregnant. He looked at his sister. How are you feeling, by the way? Any complications? I'm fine, Annie said, her voice smaller now. Good. Michael picked up the folder, flipped through it with the casual expertise of someone who'd seen plenty of legal documents. Power of attorney. Interesting. Mom, did you ask for help managing your finances? I did not. He closed the folder, set it aside. Henry, Annie, gentlemen, would you mind giving me a moment alone with my mother? Now, wait just a minute, Henry started. I'm not asking. Something in Michael's voice, the same authority he used with difficult patients, made the lawyers shift uncomfortably. Henry looked to Annie for support, but she was staring at her hands again. We'll be right over there, Richard Kirk said, gesturing toward the bar. Mrs. McKenna, please don't make any hasty decisions. When they'd moved away, Michael leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mom, what's really going on here? For the first time that evening, I felt tears threaten. Not tears of sadness, relief. Recognition. At least one of my children still saw me as a person, not a resource to be managed. They want me to sign over power of attorney, I said. Annie says if I don't, I won't see my grandchild. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming the table, a habit from childhood when he was working through a complex problem. How much did they ask for originally? For the wedding? $65,000. He whistled low. And you offered 15. Which is generous. More than generous. He glanced toward the bar, where Henry was gesticulating to the lawyers. Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Are you having any problems? Memory issues, confusion, anything that might make them think you need help managing your affairs? I almost laughed. Michael, last month I balanced my checkbook to the penny, renegotiated my car insurance to save $200 a year, and caught an $800 error in my property tax assessment. Does that sound like someone who needs financial management? No, he said, his jaw tightening in the way Harold's used to when he was truly angry. It sounds like someone who taught her son how to manage money so well he graduated medical school with minimal debt. You worked for that. I worked for it because you taught me the value of work. The weight of protecting what you've built. He looked at Annie across the room. What happened to her, Mom? When did she become this person? It was the question I'd been asking myself for months. Years. When had my daughter's ambition curdled into entitlement? When had her dreams become demands? When had her love become conditional on what I could provide, rather than who I was? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe I protected her too much. Maybe I made things too easy. Or maybe Henry happened to her. I followed his gaze to where Henry was now on his phone, his free hand cutting through the air in sharp gestures. Even from across the room, I could see the calculation in his posture. You think he's behind this? I think he's a man who sees an opportunity. But Annie is 34 years old. She's responsible for her own choices. He covered my hand with his. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Before I could answer, Henry was striding back toward us, the lawyers trailing behind. Annie followed more slowly, one hand pressed to her stomach, protective or performative. I could no longer tell the difference. Sorry to interrupt, Henry said, not sounding sorry at all. But we have a timeline. The wedding's in 3 months, vendors need deposits, venues need securing. Of course, I said, standing slowly. Timeline? How thoughtful of you to mention that. I picked up my purse, checking for my phone. Around us, the restaurant hummed with normal conversations, couples sharing wine, families celebrating birthdays. Unaware that at table 12, a family was being dissected with surgical precision. I've made my decision, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Annie's face went very still. And I smiled, the same smile I'd worn at PTA meetings when dealing with teachers who underestimated other people's children. The same smile I'd perfected during 40 years of marriage to a man who occasionally tested my patience, but never my loyalty. I'll sign, I said. Relief washed over Henry's face. Richard Kirk actually smiled. Even Annie's shoulders relaxed slightly. But first, I continued, reaching for my phone, there's someone else who should have a say. I scrolled to the number I'd added 2 weeks ago, a precaution after Annie's first ultimatum, when a mother's intuition whispered this reconciliation might be anything but. Louise? It's Annie McKenna. Yes, I know it's late. Could you come to Franco's? Bring the documents we discussed. Henry's expression shifted from relief to confusion to something approaching alarm. Who is Louise? I set the phone down carefully. My attorney. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. More dangerous. Richard Kirk's predatory smile vanished entirely. Your attorney, Henry repeated slowly. When did you hire an attorney? The same day you started asking my neighbors about my mental state, I said, watching his face. Did you really think Mrs. Anderson wouldn't mention that a nice young man had stopped by, asking if I'd been acting strangely? Forgetting things? Making poor decisions? Annie paled. Mom, we never. Never what, sweetheart? Never had Henry drive through my neighborhood taking pictures of my house? Never had him chat up my mailman about whether I'd been paying my bills on time. I kept my voice conversational. Never had his real estate friend pull comps on my property? Michael leaned back, piecing it together with the rapid assessment that made him good at his job. Annie, how long have you been planning this? It's not what you think, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I opened my purse and pulled out a small manila envelope. I think it's exactly what it looks like. A systematic attempt to prove I'm incompetent to manage my own affairs. I spread the contents across the table, photographs Henry had taken of my house. Printed emails between him and a private investigator. Inquiries about my medical records, my banking habits, my daily routines. Louise has been very thorough, I said as the lawyers examined the documents with growing discomfort. It's amazing what people will tell a private investigator who looks like someone's sweet grandmother. The youngest attorney was sweating now. Mrs. McKenna, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about our client's intentions. Oh, I understand the intentions perfectly, I said, gathering the papers. The question is, did you? Louise arrived 12 minutes later, striding through Franco's with the purposeful energy of a woman who'd spent 30 years practicing family law. At 70, she was small, silver-haired, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel underestimate her at their peril. Annie, she said warmly, settling into the chair Michael provided. And this must be your daughter. The contrast was immediate. Where I'd been isolated, surrounded by predators, Louise's presence shifted the balance entirely. Gentlemen, she said, surveying the group like a surgeon examining a tumor. I believe you have some documents for Mrs. McKenna to sign. Richard Kirk cleared his throat. This is a family matter, Ms. Louise Qualls. Of Qualls, Peterson, and Associates. And you're quite right, this is a family matter. Which is why I'm here to ensure Mrs. McKenna's family relationships aren't being exploited for financial gain. She opened her briefcase, removing a thick folder. Before we discuss power of attorney, I think you should see what Mrs. McKenna has already put in place. The documents she spread across the table were pristine, official, bearing the county courthouse seal. As Henry leaned forward to read them, I watched his face change, confusion to understanding to something like panic. Irrevocable trust, Louise explained conversationally. Established 2 weeks ago. Mrs. McKenna's assets, her house, investments, life insurance, all transferred to the McKenna Family Trust. That's, Henry started, then stopped, his legal knowledge apparently insufficient for this situation. That's what, dear? Louise asked sweetly. Annie read over his shoulder, her voice small. It says the beneficiaries are your children, born and unborn. With Michael as trustee until they're 25. The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. I could see him recalculating, searching for an angle. But, the wedding, he demanded. Our expenses. What about them? Louise asked. The trust provides for education, medical care, reasonable living costs. I don't see how Italian marble qualifies. This is ridiculous. Henry's composure cracked. Annie, tell them. Tell them we had an agreement. Did you? Michael asked his sister quietly. An agreement? Or demands backed by threats? Annie looked around the table, at Henry's anger, the lawyers distancing themselves, Michael's disappointment, Louise's calm. Finally, her gaze settled on me. I'm pregnant, she said, as if that explained everything. We need security. We need to know our child will be provided for. Your child will be provided for, I said gently. Better than you can imagine. The trust will pay for the finest education, the best medical care, everything a grandparent would want to give. But Henry won't have access to a penny of it. You can't do this. Henry's voice rose. Annie is your daughter. You can't cut her out over a wedding. I'm not cutting her out, I said. I'm protecting her inheritance from you. Louise smiled, the kind of smile that had terrified opposing counsel for decades. Mr. Smith, perhaps you should call your own attorney. You might need independent legal advice about the implications of your premarital investigation of your fiancé's mother. The threat hung in the air. Henry looked to Kirk for support, but the older lawyer was already gathering his papers. I think, Kirk said carefully, we may have been operating under some misunderstandings. Perhaps we should postpone any signing until everyone has consulted their respective counsel. Excellent idea, Louise agreed. Mrs. McKenna? Shall we go? I stood slowly, letting the weight of what had just happened settle over the table. Annie was crying now, silent tears that might have been grief or manipulation. I no longer cared which. Annie, I said softly. When you're ready to have a real conversation about this baby, about your future, about what family actually means, call me. But call me alone. I turned to Henry, staring at the trust documents as if he could change them by will alone. As for you, I said, my voice carrying 62 years of learned authority, stay away from my family. Stay away from my house. And if I hear you've made one more inquiry about my competency or finances, Louise and I will have a very different conversation about harassment and elder abuse. Michael stood, pulling cash from his wallet for the drinks. Annie, he said to his sister, you're welcome at my place if you need somewhere to think. But you come alone. And you leave the financial scheming at the door. As we walked out, Henry's voice rose behind us, arguing with the lawyers, with Annie, about fairness and rights. The sound followed us into the cool evening air, then dissolved into the vast indifference of the universe. Louise studied me on the sidewalk. How do you feel? Inside, my daughter was probably trying to salvage her relationship with a man who saw her as a pathway to easy money. Inside, Henry was learning that some women couldn't be intimidated into surrendering what they'd built. Free, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel free. Louise nodded. Good. Now comes the hard part, deciding what to build with that freedom. 3 weeks later. I stood in my kitchen, watching morning sunlight paint geometric patterns across the linoleum floor Harold and I had installed 23 years ago. The house felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Right on time, I said, opening the door to find Janet Waters holding a casserole dish and a knowing smile. I brought my grandmother's cornbread, she said, settling into what had become her chair at my table. And I heard something interesting at the grocery store yesterday. Janet had appeared in my life like a small miracle 2 days after Franco's, a recent widow who downsized to the duplex next door. At 67, she had a gift for listening without judgment and a complete immunity to drama. Henry Smith was at the bank yesterday, she said, accepting the coffee I poured. Apparently quite upset about some frozen accounts. His business partner discovered irregularities, client deposits used for personal expenses. Her eyes sparkled with the pleasure of watching karma work efficiently. Word is, he might be facing professional difficulties. I absorbed this with the careful neutrality I'd perfected. Revenge was most satisfying when served by someone other than yourself. And Annie? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Shopping for wedding dresses at the outlets in Greenville. Apparently, the Italian marble bathroom is postponed indefinitely. We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the neighborhood come alive, children walking to school, cars starting. Ordinary life continuing. Have you heard from Michael? Janet asked. Yesterday. He said Annie called, asking if he thought she was making a mistake. I set down my mug. He told her that was a question only she could answer. Smart man, I corrected. He gets that from his father. The phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. McKenna? A young woman's voice, nervous. This is Diana Reed from the Meridian Community Center. We heard about your situation from Louise Qualls. We have a program for seniors dealing with financial exploitation, people whose families are taking advantage of them. Louise thought you might be uniquely qualified to help. The irony wasn't lost on me, my family crisis becoming a way to help others. But there was something appealing about turning poison into medicine. Tell me more, I said. Diana explained the program, Seniors Helping Seniors, sharing strategies, legal resources, emotional support. A lifeline for those betrayed by the people they trusted most. We meet Tuesday evenings, she said. Very informal. Coffee and conversation. But we've helped quite a few people avoid situations like yours. I'll think about it, I said, though I was already imagining myself in that room. After I hung up, Janet studied me. You're going to do it. Not a question. Probably good, she said. You need something that's yours. Something that has nothing to do with being anyone's mother or grandmother, or victim. Exactly the right thing to say. 6 months later. I stood in the community center, watching 12 women and 3 men arrange folding chairs in a circle. Good evening, everyone, I said, calling the meeting to order with the natural authority I'd discovered over the past months. For our newcomers, I'm Annie McKenna. This is our weekly gathering for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members. The words still carried a sting, but the clean pain of a healing wound, not the infected agony of a fresh betrayal. Tonight, I continued, we'll talk about what comes after. After you've protected yourself. After you've set boundaries. What comes next? It was a question I could finally answer. For me, said Eddie Chase, a 78-year-old former teacher, what came next was realizing I could live alone, and like it. Nods around the circle. Independence was a common theme here, not isolation, but the satisfied solitude of choosing your own company over toxic relationships. I learned I didn't have to forgive, added Sheila Phelps, whose son had stolen her identity. Everyone said I had to because he's family. But my therapist helped me understand, forgiveness isn't mandatory for healing. Michael had become an unofficial counselor to our group, stopping by monthly to discuss the psychology of financial abuse. His insights helped me see that my guilt over Annie wasn't failure, it was a normal response to an abnormal situation. Annie? Carolyn Franklin, one of our regulars, asked. What came after for you? I looked around the circle, at faces that had become familiar, dear. People who'd seen me cry, rage, doubt myself, and gradually find my footing. Purpose, I said finally. For 40 years, my purpose was being a wife and mother. After Harold died, I thought it was protecting what we'd built to pass on. But what came after was realizing my purpose might be protecting other mothers from what I went through. Louise had referred clients to me, women navigating family financial crises. I'd discovered a talent for spotting manipulation and teaching resistance. How do you handle the sadness? Asked the new woman, soft-voiced, well-dressed, but with the shell-shocked look of someone whose world had fundamentally shifted. How do you stop missing who they used to be? The question hit center mass. Because the truth was, I did miss Annie. Not the woman she'd become, but the little girl who brought me dandelions. The teenager who asked for advice about boys. The young woman proud of her parents' marriage. I don't think you stop missing them, I admitted. I think you learn to mourn them while protecting yourself. It's possible to grieve someone who's still alive. The meeting continued, practical matters, legal resources, success stories. But that question lingered, following me home to where Janet waited with soup and updates on her own complicated family. How was group? She asked. Good. Hard. A new woman asked about missing the people our families used to be. Janet nodded. She'd survived her own children's attempts to pressure her into assisted living, not because she needed care, but because they wanted her equity. Her solution? Moving next door and informing them their inheritance was now being spent on her happiness. Speaking of missing people, she said carefully. Michael called. Annie had her baby. The words landed like a physical blow. A granddaughter, I said, though I'd known this was coming. Eleanor. My mother's name. The manipulation was so transparent it made me dizzy. Michael said Annie wants you to visit. Flexible hours, she said. I sat quietly, feeling the pull of grandmotherly instinct warring with 6 months of hard-won wisdom. Part of me wanted to rush to the hospital, hold this new life, forgive everything. But I'd learned to examine my impulses for signs of manipulation, external or internal. What do you think she wants? I asked. To use that baby to reopen negotiations about the trust. Probably true. Since Franco's, Annie had made indirect approaches, messages through Michael, birthday cards, chance encounters. Each carried the same unspoken suggestion: reconciliation is possible, if you're reasonable about the finances. The baby isn't responsible for her parents' choices, I said, more to myself. No, Janet agreed. But you're not responsible for protecting yourself from them either. The next morning, I called Louise. I've been expecting this, she said without preamble. Annie had the baby. She did. Now I have to decide what comes next. What do you want to come next? The question I'd been asking myself. Not what Annie wanted. Not what Michael thought was best. Not society's expectations. I want to meet my granddaughter, I said slowly. But on my terms. With clear boundaries. No opening myself to manipulation. That's possible, Louise said. Supervised visits through Michael. Clear protocols, topics that are off limits, behaviors that will end visits. If Annie refuses those terms, you'll know exactly where you stand. And more importantly, you'll know you protected yourself while leaving the door open for a real relationship, if she ever chooses it. That afternoon, I drafted a letter to my daughter, not the angry tirade I'd composed in my head these past months, but a calm statement of boundaries and possibilities. Annie, I would like to meet Eleanor and have a relationship with her as she grows. But any contact between us must respect my boundaries. I'm willing to visit with Eleanor in Michael's presence, with the understanding that any attempt to discuss the trust, my finances, or past grievances will end the visit immediately. If you accept these terms, have Michael arrange our first meeting. If not, I hope you'll reconsider when you're ready to prioritize Eleanor's relationship with her grandmother over your relationship with my money. I will always love the daughter you were. I am no longer available to be victimized by the person you've chosen to become. With hope for your growth. And boundaries for my protection. Mom. I sealed the envelope before I could second-guess myself, then walked to the mailbox with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between giving up and setting terms. The future was still unwritten. But I would write it on my own terms, with my own pen, in my own voice. And if my granddaughter wanted to be part of that story, she would be welcomed with love, wisdom, and the fierce protection of a grandmother who'd learned that the greatest gift you